He is most remembered as the young king who relented during the Peasants Revolt, and was known for his bravery in riding out to face the rebels inside of his capital of London. But King Richard II's reign as king was one which was dominated by rebellion, and he was deposed as King of England by Henry Bolingbroke. There has been a lot of debate around the death and demise of Richard II, who it's believed was most probably murdered by being starved to death or slaughtered inside of Pontefract Castle, being held as a prisoner. Following his death, his body was taken and displayed in St. Paul's Cathedral before it was buried. But there were rumours that the king had survived and lived. But Richard was later reinterred inside of Westminster Abbey. But what is the story of opening the coffin of King Richard II? As mentioned, as the king, Richard II came onto the throne as a boy when he was 10 in 1377, and at the time the French were turning the tide of the 100 Years' War against the English. Richard's father was known as the Black Prince, and he was a brilliant soldier, and Richard was Edward III's heir after the death of his father. But at the beginning of his reign, his advisers and counsellors dictated domestic and foreign policy, and they heavily taxed the English population, which led to the Peasants Revolt, the deadly uprising that broke out inside of London and across much of the south of England. The Archbishop of Canterbury was executed on Tower Hill, having been taken shelter inside the Tower of London, and the Treasurer of England was also slaughtered. But Richard rode out to lead the rebels away from London, meeting the leader of the rebels, Wat Tyler, who was then killed, as some claimed he made a lunge at the boy king. Richard promised much to the rebels, but once things had settled down, he did not give in and went back on his words. Richard II then married Anne of Bohemia, the daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV, but his behaviour as king was not always the greatest, and he led an extravagant household, and there were attempts by his counsellors to broker peace with France, which led to more protests. It was from 1389 that Richard declared himself to be of age to rule, and he was more prominently involved in matters of government, and he accumulated a huge amount of wealth, imposing heavy fines on many different people. He used much of his money to fund expeditions to Ireland and to try and pursue peace with France. In 1392, he took 10,000 from the pocket of Londoners, but his wife passed away in 1394. He was viewed by many as a tyrant following her death, and he would become more brutal and would execute many, including the Earl of Arundel, for disputes with the king, and he imprisoned a number of his earls. He was a man who was becoming hated by his people and population, and he was in a fragile position as the king. In 1397, he attacked the Lords Appellant, some of the king's advisers. He seized their lands and wealth, and his uncle, Thomas of Woodstock, was murdered with the Earl of Arundel, as mentioned, also executed on Tower Hill. Thomas Beauchamp, the Earl of Warwick, and the Archbishop of Canterbury were exiled, but then Henry of Bolingbroke, the future Henry IV, led a rebellion that landed at Ravenspur in Yorkshire, and then managed to capture and depose King Richard II. Henry IV allowed King Richard II to live following his abdication, but this did change as he was concerned that there would be a plot to oust him and then restore Richard to the throne. But having Richard alive was dangerous for the king, and around the 14th of February 1400 it's believed that Richard inside of Pontefract Castle did die. There are some rumours regarding his demise and that the king was brutally murdered. However, his body was, as mentioned, taken to Old St. Paul's Cathedral, where it was then displayed for the public. The body of Richard II was then buried at a friary in Langley, in Hertfordshire. However, Richard II had ordered the construction of a tomb for himself, which was built inside of Westminster Abbey, and it was a tomb in which his wife would be buried with him also. But it was Henry V, the son of the man who usurped Richard, who had the body of Richard exhumed. He had Richard placed inside of the tomb, and the king had commissioned during his life. But over the years there was a significant amount of investigation carried out regarding Richard's bones and remains. A number of plaques were removed from the tomb, and this left holes being made in the tomb, and over the years some visitors to the abbey did put their hands inside of the holes, and some even managed to take some of the bones of Richard II. In 1766 his mandible was removed, but before more could be taken the holes were blocked up, but the air had also led to the remains being in a poorer state of decay than they should have been. The bones were then examined also at the time, and it was found that inside of the tomb were a number of copper crowns. In the August of 1871, an investigation led by the Dean of Westminster, Arthur Stanley, was carried out on the bones of Richard II. Inside the tomb was found the broken and rotten boards of the coffin, and the bones of he and his wife were in a very strange way. The skulls of Richard and his wife were found lying towards their feet, and both of the lower jaws were missing, and the copper crowns which were noted had also been taken. A set of shears had also been placed in the coffin, which had been used to open the original lead coffin that Richard was buried in, and also the king's staff, 2 pairs of gloves, nails from the coffin, and part of silk were found. The skull of Richard was examined, and it was said to have contained parts of the brain which looked as if they were 2 walnuts reunited, and following the examination, the bones were then placed in the correct order and in a single chest, acting almost as a new coffin for Richard. The other things found were put inside of another box, but then in 1905 the mandible of Richard II was returned to the coffin by Reverend G.T. Andrews, who had been given it from his uncle, who had been a schoolboy when he took it from the coffin. Permission to place this back inside of the coffin was granted in the January of 1906 by the king of the time, Edward VII. The bones were wrapped in linen, and a small hole in the tomb was made so the bone could be placed back with the rest of the body. As a king, many people believed that Richard II was a terrible one, and who ruled with misadventure and almost like a tyrant. Some historians debate this, and some even believe he may have had a personality disorder that led to him being the ruthless man in the latter part of his reign that he became. But Richard's reign was dominated by rebellion, and he was then ousted from the throne by Henry IV, and it was inside of his custody that the king, at the age of 33, starved to death or was slaughtered upon the orders of the new king. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.